Hello and welcome to the Land and Climate podcast. My name is Bertie Harrison-Broninsky, and today I'm talking to Ma Tianjie about his new book, In Search of Green China. Tianjie started his career in 2004 with Greenpeace when it first set operations in mainland China. He later headed the Beijing office of environmental journalism outlet China Dialogue until that office was closed in 2022. His book recounts the history of environmental policy in China across those 2 decades, often positioning it as caught between the push and pull of domestic grassroots activism on one hand and a relentless systematized drive for growth on the other. It's a nuanced analysis with interesting case studies of key events, such as how pollution of the Hawaii River became a political scandal in the 1990s that kick-started a lot of the country's environmental policy, through to how administrators dealt with severe smog problems in major cities in the early 2010s.
Water pollution was a very, very big issue. We're talking about cancer villages all across the country, especially in those big river basins where a lot of the industries were concentrated. A lot of the local governments were trapped in this one-dimensional developmental mindset. Political careers of those local caterers are very much attached to how fast you can grow your local economy, how much revenue you can bring.
I began by asking Tianjie why he wanted to write the book and what his ambitions were in doing so.
There are obviously a lot of interest in China's environmental policy and development, especially in terms of its climate change policies. Internationally, I think the attention has been very much focused on the international politics dimensions of it. I think the key questions that are on the minds of a lot of the audience in foreign countries, especially in the West, is often that whether China can be trusted as a partner on solving climate change problem, whether, for example, the data coming out of China is reliable and things like that, because there's a whole international trust issue. The reason I want to write this book to a largely English audience is exactly because I think besides this international politics dimension, there has always been the domestic dimension in China's environmental pursuit, right? China is not doing all of its policy and environmental policy just for an international audience or just to satisfy international pressure. There is always a struggle inside China from bottom up, right? From grassroots, trying to push the government to do more, to clean up the air, to clean up the soil, to clean up the water, right? And to deliver a better natural environment for its own people. I think that struggle is a story that is less known, I think, internationally. And I think it deserves to be told in a more coherent way, especially over a 30-year period when that's basically where I think the narrative arc of the story really is.
Do you think that that domestic narrative that you set out also does challenge or perhaps edit some of the more Western narrative around China, in that you do focus on kind of policy debate within Chinese government and the response to domestic protest and topics like that, which perhaps don't fit the kind of more generalized narrative of top-down authoritarian governance in China? Or was that something that you were looking to nuance as well?
Yes. So my aim is to show basically the evolution, right, of China's approach to the environment. Today, I think people understand China's environmental policy more from this top-down authoritarianism angle. I think a lot of the current policy is actually driven by bottom-up pressure from citizens, from NGOs, especially early on in the 1990s and the early 2000s. They played a very important role in raising the awareness of China's environmental plight and also using all kinds of tactics to bring that to the table of top policy makers. We have witnessed basically a shift of paradigm. Before, I think around 2013, when air pollution really became a big issue inside China, it was basically an uphill battle for a lot of the grassroots environmental advocates trying to convince policymakers that environmental issues should be a priority issue for the Chinese society. But after the catastrophic air pollution around 2011 to 2013, I think environmental issue finally got picked up by China's ruling Communist Party as one of the core pursuit of the government and the party itself, right? And then it got incorporated into the governing philosophy of the Chinese Communist Party. And I think the whole approach shifted again towards a very goal-oriented, very top-down, very developmentalist environmentalism in China. So I think that journey and evolution is also a very interesting story for people to understand where China's current environmental approach comes from.
So would you say that the bottom-up grassroots influence or internal debate is less now than it was perhaps 15 years ago?
I think that's true because in China, there's no longer a debate basically about, okay, whether we should actually take environmental issues seriously and whether this is a serious policy issue. In 2018, when the party put ecological civilization into one of the 5 core pursuit or core missions of the Chinese Communist Party, it put it into the party's charter, right? Basically, it's the party's platform. Then the debate itself ended, right? So nobody's questioning now, okay, whether we should take environmental issues seriously and whether this is a core political issue for the government. It is. So I think the approach now is very much top-down. The party sets an overarching goal for like environmental well-being of the country. There's a carbon neutrality goal, and there are also other ecologically related goals. And the party has embodied that goal into a set of incentives and punishments inside the party kind of discipline system, right? Forcing local governments to fall in line into that agenda. So I think currently it's very much driven by the government apparatus across the board, not just the environmental ministry. But still, I think as my book has shown, there are internal contradictions between this approach to the economic growth model that China relied on to keep its economy strong, right, and growing. And that internal contradiction hasn't been fully resolved yet, right? And that's why you still need pressure from grassroots players to keep the pressure on, also to monitor backpedaling and to spot when implementation isn't strong enough. So there's still a role played by civil society. But I think the overarching role has shifted already, probably 10 years ago.
Now, I do want to pick you up on that point about growth models. I'm also conscious that you said this was almost the opposite of what you wanted to talk about in the book, but just because you mentioned it, I was interested to get your take on that point about trust, because I imagine our listeners would be interested to hear that as well. Is Chinese data on environmental outcomes reliable to foreign actors? Is that something that you've seen change over the past few decades?
I think it's increasingly more reliable because the kind of shift that I just mentioned. If we are talking about, for example, environmental pollution in China in the 1990s or early 2000s, it was like really terrible, especially at that time. Water pollution was a very, very big issue. We're talking about cancer villages all across the country, especially in those big river basins where a lot of the industries were concentrated. A lot of the local governments were trapped in this one-dimensional developmental mindset. Political careers of those local caterers are very much attached to how fast you can grow your local economy, how much revenue you can bring to your own jurisdiction, especially when you are competing with the county chief just next door. That internal competition mechanism is very strong in those years, which leads to all kinds of tactics trying to evade environmental regulation that was available at that time. That's why you see all kinds of, for example, fabrications of emissions data, right? Cover up of severe pollution stories or pollution accidents on the local level. And even I think the central government at the time couldn't trust what the local governments had been sending them in terms of environmental quality data and things like that. So I think there was a realization of that problem. And when the central government really wanted to tackle environmental issue and really want to shift the gear of its economic growth model to a greener model, I think one of the first things they did is to fix the data problem. So this is particularly obvious in the air pollution battle when in 2012, the central government really made an effort of setting up centrally managed monitoring stations across the country, right? So they're literally putting all those monitors and devices, right, across the country that the local governments are not supposed to touch, right? So these very expensive gadgets that monitors the fine particulate matters in a locality was sort of locked, and they're only accessible by a central government team, right? There are, of course, still attempts by some local governments trying to tamper with that monitoring. One of the tactics they do is, for example, sprinkling like clean water around that station so that they can artificially suppress pollution data from that station. But again, this is something that is punishable under the new approach. And there were a few high-profile cases of entire groups of environmental officials being jailed, right, for doing that. I think increasingly the environmental data from China are more reliable, and that's also used by the central government as an indicator of, to monitor how well the different provinces are actually shifting their, for example, industrial structure based on the direction set by the central government, right? So because the central government wants to, for example, reduce the amount of heavy industry in a particular province, and they use PM 2.5, the particulate matter data, as an indicator of how well this shift is being underway, right, in those provinces. I think there is a stronger incentive from at least the central government, right, to make sure the data are reliable and can be used as a good yardstick for a slightly different economy. And I think that's also part of the evolution.
It's hard at the moment to talk about anything in the climate sector without bringing up the way that President Trump in the US is kind of rolling back a lot of environmental research and regulation and ambition, and more broadly, the way that there's been a kind of backlash against ESG in the corporate world in the West in the past year. Do you think that China might actually be set to take on more of a leadership role in the kind of global stage on these issues, whether it's for research or for regulation?
I think there are two parts, right, to answering that question. One is whether China takes leadership or takes more leadership on the international stage. And there's a question mark about how much more, right, China wants to do internationally, especially under the Paris Agreement regime, because in that front, I think the reservation from China is more the historical role played by so-called developed countries. And China has always still, right, maintains that it's a developing country. And historically, the international obligations should be shouldered more by the industrialized countries. So even though I think China has more means and capabilities to do more in terms of, for example, supporting the decarbonization efforts of the global South by African, Latin American countries, in theory, it can do more. But I think it is also bound by this very strong principle, right, that is still upholding that it is the historical responsibility of the industrialized world to do more, especially on the finance side, about climate change globally. So I think it probably won't cross that line very soon, especially I think in today's kind of international political environment. But that said, I think domestically, in terms of China's own policy, I think there's also a strong sense that China is not backing down or from its own carbon neutrality goals, because it has sort of internalized that goal as a key developmental goal for China itself. I think especially in the past few years, China realized that its strategy of using those green indicators, right, as overarching economic yardsticks has really paid off. I think before 2012, there were similar arguments inside China, like the political right in the West is saying that climate action, environmental action is really kind of a burden, right, on the economy. At that time, actually, in China, people are arguing it's a plot by Western countries to try to restrain China from its developmental potentials. But I think after a few years, when those green indicators really kicked off domestic industries on, like, for example, EV, solar panels, wind power, they became increasingly the engine of actual economic growth in China. If you look at the data today, I think, for example, 40 or 30% or 40% of China's economic growth are associated with sectors that are considered low carbon, right? So the whole EV supply chain is generating all kinds of new jobs and new economic opportunities in China. So I think there's a realization that this actually paid off, using this green indicators as kind of a stimulus for local governments to innovate, for local governments to think about new ways of economic growth is a good strategy. And I think China is one of the few countries that are actually embracing this kind of strategy and trying to push the economy further on this line. So domestically, I don't think there is strong momentum as we're seeing, for example, in the US to like backtrack or backpedaling on its climate goals.
the relationship between green policy and growth models or economic growth objectives is perhaps the most consistent background theme in your book, and it's something that you've been mentioning now as well. Could you discuss a little bit the relationship and tensions between models of development and growth and green policy in China over the 20 years that you discuss in the book? And the other kind of similar tension in the book is between environmental protection and climate action. It's just interesting to hear you kind of give a summary of how those different threads have been in competition with each other or have sometimes aligned over the years, and perhaps where you see that going in the future as well.
China, I think, has really been this poster child, especially in the first 20 years of the period that my book covers, a poster child of entrepreneurish government. It's by design. So the economic reforms post-Mao was really about remaking the Chinese state to become kind of a developmental machine. Basically, the central idea of that new model is to make local governments, provincial government and local governments compete with each other to achieve economic goals. So especially the so-called GDP growth goals, right? I mentioned the book, like China probably was the only country in the world where GDP measurement was at every level of the government, all the way from the central government down to every county level. So every county chief in China is bound by how much you can grow your GDP. Right. And that's sort of a new thing being intentionally introduced in the 1980s, right, to turn the economy to a growth track. That system has its success. I mean, that's the secret sauce of China's economic miracle from the 1980s onwards. But it also comes with a lot of consequences, right? Because when those local governments really become the kind of business developers, right, in their own right, then they can sacrifice everything else from labor rights to environmental pollution. Everything has to be sacrificed to generate that extra amount of GDP growth. That kind of model still works in a large way today because the institutional memory and the system was so strong. So basically every communist leader on local and provincial levels are still appraised, right, in terms of their performance, very much on the economic indicators. So every year when their boss, right, sits down with them basically and assess, okay, how successful you were in the past year, like economic indicators were still the most important ones. Since the early 2000s, when other social problems become more obvious, right? So you're talking about labor strikes, you're talking about environmental pollution. There has always been kind of an effort trying to tweak that model into a more balanced one. So they have been introducing more indicators to the local leaders, right? So that they can take care of some of the other concerns in the society. But I think the fundamental model hasn't been changed. Still, there is a very strong incentive for local governments to maintain a level of economic growth. And that has always been one of the key sources of their political capital and their political legitimacy. And I think since 2013, especially since the air pollution disasters, there has been an effort of shifting that model. But I think it haven't been sort of substituting that old model yet, right? They have been adding on new indicators to the performance reviews, but the fundamentals are still about, okay, how good your local economy has been growing. So I think this is a struggle. I think that is ongoing currently. We're seeing the challenges of trying to reinvent that fundamental model because a lot of the, for example, local government budgets, a lot of the fiscal health of the local governments are also very now bound with the economic model. So when you try to change the engine, you are also sort of risking the car stop completely. And that's the balancing act the central policymakers are trying to make these days. Because when you say, okay, we're not going to rely on large infrastructure investments, we're not going to rely on heavy industries, we're not going to rely on the booming like real estate sector as your engine of generating fast economic growth. What's your new engine? And we mentioned about the green industries, right? EVs, batteries, wind and solar, and they are stepping in as new engines, but they still cannot fully substitute the old model. Currently, we're seeing this kind of balancing act being played out on a very large scale. So what's the next stage of China's economic growth, if you want to keep the local government still afloat to paying for social welfare on the local level, what's their new source of revenue? And I think that's a $1 million question for China at this moment. There is some hope that those new industries are going to play a bigger role, but we're also seeing pushbacks, right, internationally because of all the supplies, right, China is producing and selling to other countries. It's still an ongoing juggle on the national scale.
At the risk of being kind of overly reductive, would it be a fair reading to say that the growth incentive has been a key aspect of enabling this kind of surge of renewables and EVs and green technologies, but has also been the cause of a lot of the environmental issues, the kind of corner cutting that you describe and leading to pollution and so forth?
Yeah, that's correct. Because the previous model was so successful, especially on the economic front, there's a lot of vested interest in that model, right? You've got especially like state-owned companies and local governments being in a strong alliance of maintaining that model because it generates political rewards so fast. If you, let's say, have a developer interested in clearing up a large piece of land just for a fancy, gigantic real estate project, it immediately generates a lot of GDP for your jurisdiction. And why not, right? Especially for the local governments that are like desperate for having the GDP numbers really good looking. But the central government currently is telling them that no, you shouldn't only rely on those very polluting, right, very carbon intensive models to generate your GDP. And you should seek, right, other cleaner industries and things like that. And they're creating incentive for that. But I think there's still this kind of tug of war of quick money that can actually be very easy, right, for the local governments vis-a-vis the more challenging new developments that the central government wants to see happening more.
And do you see a pathway to alleviating that tug of war, or do you think that's fairly baked in now?
And I think that's probably where the limitations of China's current model is, because it still very much relies on what I call supply side environmentalism. What you are seeing is the central government being currently, okay, we can say them very enlightened on the environmental issue, trying to create all kinds of incentives or even using some kind of coercion for the local governments to shift gear. Probably this is the only thing the Chinese central government can do by, okay, basically ordering like the dismantling of a huge chunk of steel making capacity in a certain province. They are setting actual targets of millions of tons of capacity being dismantled and literally blown up in the province to make way for other industrial cleaner manufacturing capacities. But you can only go so far with this supply side approach, because what we are also seeing is that the demand side, environmental demands, are not strong enough because the government has been relying on its own power to tell the local governments do this and that on the environmental front. We're not seeing, for example, consumers being more willing to pay a premium for all kinds of green innovations and green products, right, that are supposed to be the pull of a greener model. That's the imbalance that we're seeing, and increasingly probably will be the limitation of the current approach, right? Because in the end, you need to have environmentally conscious clientele, a large consumer base for whatever green innovation that is happening in the market. You need to have companies who can get rewarded for selling a little bit more green services and green products to a large consumer market. And that could kick off a more virtual cycle of business. You have consumers that are demanding greener products, demanding slightly cleaner projects or greener options. And then you have the corporate innovators that can serve that needs, right? And there's a whole virtuous cycle of driving the economic growth through that. But currently what we're seeing is basically just a supply side, right? So you are seeing the government tearing down a lot of old polluting industries, besides the EVs and wind power and these kind of things, without a lot of new green opportunities actually in the market. In the end, this will limit how far the green model could go without the cooperation of the Chinese general public. And that's the problem of suppressing civil society in this model. After 2013, there's really this shift of back to a top-down green model. But I think in the end, you still need civil society to educate the consumers, educate the public, to mobilize the public in being part of this green journey, to be at least consumers for greener products and innovations so that this model can go forward in a more sustainable way. And that's, I think, probably the fundamental limitations, right, of this current model.
I was interested to kind of go back. You said you started Greenpeace in Beijing in 2004. That sounds from your book like it was quite an interesting time in this field, on the verge of what you describe as a kind of green hurricane in new interventions, some fairly relatively radical policy from the environmental agency in China. Could you tell us a bit about some of the work that you were doing in the mid-noughties and some of the things that were happening in that space? And also, it would be nice to hear a bit about the grassroots backlash that was happening that preceded that to some of the kind of environmental problems.
Yeah, so the early 2000s was really an interesting time, right? Because at that time, it was when environmental problems, right, in China really became a national topic, because the early 2000s was when the old growth model that we mentioned were really at its peak. China joined the WTO in 2001, and the industrial production just took off like a rocket. Across the country, you are seeing rampant pollution problems, right? Water, you are seeing entire rivers turning like black or even red. You are seeing entire field of crops fail because of a big smelter that is putting up a lot of like dust next door. You are seeing like entire villages of cancer victims because of the pollution that was around them. So I think in the early 2000s, this really became a national story. And this was also thanks to the liberalization of the national media around that same time, when a whole generation of journalists breaking off from the old kind of state media system become the actual muckrakers of newsmakers. They are looking for interesting stories that they can write about, right, for a new generation of market-oriented media. So I think these factors came together in the early 2000s to really push the environmental agenda on the national stage. And I think this message was being picked up by also kind of visionary politicians inside the Chinese system. So we are seeing a few interesting figures. One of them was Pan Yue, right? As I mentioned, he was this very young, ambitious environmental vice minister at the time in China's environmental agency. And he was one of the pioneers of trying to create a new environmental system for China, because he was seeing the damages caused by the old growth model. And I think a lot of the ideas that he experimented with while he was vice minister really have a long-lasting impact even today, right? So a lot of the interesting policies that we're seeing today, the ideas probably came from those years when people like Pan Yue were really thinking about, okay, how do we fix this current system that is clearly not working, especially for nature and for the environment and for people's health. So one of the ideas they experimented with was so-called green GDP. So because at that time, this obsession with GDP growth was already seen as a big problem. And Pan Yue was one of the first people inside the government to say, okay, shall we actually review how we calculate GDP? Because all those damages you are causing to the environment and to people's health were not actually being deducted from how you count it as growth. And that's sort of absurd when you are basically destroying the foundation of your whole civilization by creating a whole labor force that's sick. This is definitely not growth in any sense. You should deduct a lot of those damages, right, from your growth figures. So he actually tried to do that, but he was pushed back very strongly by the provincial governments who don't want to see their political achievements shrink because of that new way of calculating GDP. But he also experimented with other ideas. And I think one of the key ideas being picked up today is that you should basically install kind of new stewardship for China's natural environment as a national endowment or a national treasure for future generations. And you should not squander them just for short-term economic gains. You should take a civilizational perspective, because the long-term well-being of the Chinese civilization will relying on those big rivers, those fertile soil and clean air that keeps delivering for the country. So this environmental nationalism idea was sort of being first articulated by Pan Yue, and now we're seeing it being picked up probably very strongly by President Xi Jinping. I think a lot of the current China's environmental ideas of stewardship was originally articulated around that time, because those people like Pan Yue and all other senior officials in China are seeing that kind of damages and environmental destruction as really harming China's long-term competitive position in the world, because you are destroying your own labor force, right? You are destroying your own resources just for some very short-term gains. And if you are thinking of long-term, that's not a good way of running a country. And I think that's sort of the fundamental idea. And I think that was contributed very much by the civil society that exposed a lot of the environmental destruction, the national media that run a lot of stories about those destructions. That finally brought about a fundamental soul searching inside the Chinese system about how the country is being run. And it was the origin of a lot of the environmental policies today.
My thanks to Ma Tianjie for coming on the show, and to Vasco Kostovski for our audio engineering. As always, we'll link further reading in the blurb, including an excerpt of the book published on Land and Climate Review. We've actually published a few interesting excerpts from new books recently, so do check out the opinion page of our website if you're looking for something new to read at the moment. If you enjoyed this episode and haven't already, please do subscribe to us on your favourite podcast platform, and then we'll see you again in 2 weeks. Until then, thanks for listening.